All right, continuing the jolly theme of death and killing, today's topic will be abortion. Specifically, a single article, a very influential, much anthologized article called A Defense of Abortion, written by a philosopher called Judith Jarvis Thomson, who is still at MIT, I believe, and published in 1971, which, it's important to note, was before the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade, which struck down state laws against abortion. Abortion was never illegal in every state of the U.S., but it was illegal for any kind of abortion in several states in the U.S. You could research which ones those were. For example, it was legal in places like Massachusetts, but I'm pretty sure it was illegal in places like Texas. Roe versus Wade struck down laws banning abortion, except laws banning abortion before the fetus was viable. And that's been much discussed ever since. And may possibly Roe versus Wade may possibly be reversed given the current makeup of the situation that Judith Jarvis Thomson was writing in the early 70s when abortion was illegal in several states. So that's the background she writes it in. Now, there are many different ways to approach the issue of abortion, and all of them have been taken by various writers at various points. A very well-trodden controversy in the debate on abortion is the status of the fetus. When, if at all, does it become a moral person? A moral person, let's say, is one that has rights, including, in fact, the right to life. And, of course, many people who eat animals say that it's okay to eat animals, it's okay to kill animals for food, because they are not moral persons. They lack a morally relevant feature that would make them rights bearers. Now, we've looked at that issue, and some people suggest it's simply that they're not human, so it's their species. But that view, I think, is fairly hard to defend and seems clearly to be something called speciesism, which is as indefensible as similar claims about sex or race. You know, if you made the claim that certain humans are not moral persons because they're a different race from us, that's clearly outrageous. And I think if you make the same claim about another creature, that simply because it's a different species from us, it's not a moral person. Let's assume, like in the Stephen Law, they have all the other capabilities of a normal adult human. They can think and talk, like the smart pig in the Stephen Law chapter on eating meat. Then just to say it's okay to eat the smart pig because it's a pig is speciesism. All right. So the issue that was most discussed in the topic is the fetus a person? And there was another widely anthologized article by a philosopher called Marianne Warren, who argued that the fetus is not a person because it lacks various important features that persons must have, which is very similar to the argument that goes on in animal rights. So, for example, not capable of speech, not capable of self-motivated activity, that kind of thing. What's very interesting about Thomson's article is that she says right from the outset, I'm not going to get into that discussion. I'm not going to debate whether or not the fetus is a person. I'm just going to say, for the sake of argument, that the fetus is a person from conception. Now, she makes it clear at the beginning and the end of her article that she doesn't actually believe this. She doesn't believe that the fetus is a person any more than an acorn is an oak tree. And she thinks that the argument, she looks at one popular argument for saying that that we should regard the fetus as a person, because she says it's difficult when to draw the line. For example, we want to say that newborn babies, of course, are persons. You can't go around killing newborn persons, but they're very similar, obviously, to just preborn, very late-term fetuses. You know, obviously, there's very little difference indeed if you look at them themselves. And in fact, there have been, it's quite often the case that babies are born very premature and yet survive. My nephew and niece were born very premature, and he weighed less than 3 pounds and she weighed less than 2 pounds at birth, and they're going strong. They're, you know, they're what? How old are they now? 16 or 17? 17 now. So they managed to survive, and clearly they, after they were born, there was very little difference between them and, you know, a 2 pound or 1 pound fetus. So the argument goes, where do you draw the line? It's impossible to pick a hard and fast line because it's all a continuum of growth. So she doesn't like that argument. She says you can make the same argument. You can't tell when an acorn becomes an oak tree, so therefore we should call an acorn an oak tree. She says, well, that's ridiculous. An acorn is not an oak tree. But she says, I'm going to put that to one side. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to stay out of that debate, even though I don't believe that certainly first trimester fetuses are persons, moral persons. I'm going to say that they are. I'm going to grant from conception, from the moment the sperm fertilizes the egg, I'm going to say that's a fully fledged person with all the rights of an adult. People, however, would take that on. I mean, in the reading on, in the Milan Engel reading on vegetarianism that you just did for the last section, a couple of sections ago on vegetarianism, you saw Peter Carruthers' argument. He had a thought experiment where he said, imagine a burning building, and you've got a choice between saving 100, I can't remember what animal it was, and one old guy. Everybody would say you've got to save the old guy. So clearly we don't regard animals as the same moral status as humans. Well, you could make exactly the same argument about embryos. Imagine there's a fire in the fertility clinic. And of course, in fertility clinics, they have frozen fertilized eggs. So these are the things that Thomson is granting personhood to. They're just frozen. And there's a reason why fertility clinics prefer to freeze fertilized eggs rather than just eggs and sperm separately. And that's because once the sperm fertilizes the egg instantly acquires a thick coating, and this is so as to keep out any other sperms, because other sperms are going to keep wanting to fertilize that egg even though it's already fertilized, so that the egg acquires a tough coating. And that makes it much more likely to survive the freezing process. So it's actually much better to freeze fertilized eggs than it is to freeze regular eggs. People do, but it's preferable to freeze fertilized eggs. So fertility clinics contain freezer-fulls of these fertilized eggs. And it is interesting to note how few of the pro-life people who claim to regard a fertilized egg as a person object to in vitro fertilization process, because it inevitably results in the destruction of lots of these things. Quite apart from, I mean, they throw them away. People fertilize a bunch of these eggs because the in vitro process is quite likely to fail. And it's quite, in order to produce the eggs, the mother has to go on quite powerful hormone pills, so she doesn't want to do this a bunch of times. So she produces a bunch of eggs. They fertilize them all. They implant 1 or 2, sometimes 3, and in the case of Octomom, who you're probably too young to remember, all 8 of her implants are rare, and the doctors usually advise a selective abortion in that case, because having octuplets is very dangerous for all 8 of them. But anyway, they keep a bunch of the frozen eggs frozen, and quite often people don't want them. They have the process, they have the kids, the process worked, they forget about them, and the fertility clinic just destroys them on a regular basis. If you seriously believe that the fertilized egg is a person, this is mass murder. This is, as Peter Crothers, who say that. But again, if there's a fire in the fertility clinic and there's or racks and racks of these fertilized eggs, I think the one adult human. So it seems like intuitively we don't really believe that they are of the same moral worth. That's not what Thomson is going to get into. She's going to say, let's pretend they are. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is normally, as she says, if you grant that the fertilized egg is a person with the same rights as an adult human, that's normally where the argument ends. People, the pro-life camp, the anti-abortion camp, thinks that if you grant that, then they've won automatically. Once you grant that, you can't have an abortion. Like the slogan goes, it's not a choice, it's a child, which is meant to be against the pro-choice position. Once you regard it, the fertilized egg, as having the rights of a child, then of course you can't have an abortion. But she says, no, I don't think that argument works. I don't think that simply granting that the fertilized egg is a person gets you to an anti-abortion position automatically. And in fact, she argues that even if you grant that the fetus is a person, many abortions should be legal, even if it's as if you're killing an adult human. And of course, that's why she gives a thought experiment involving an adult human, a famous violinist, standing in for the fetus. Okay. So she says, how does the anti-abortion argument go? Of your printout. Something like this, I take it. Every person has a right to life. So the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life, the fetus is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens to her body. This is it's a child, not a choice. Your choice is not as important as the child's life, is the implication of that slogan. And so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed, and abortion may not be performed. That's how the argument normally goes, and she says, sounds pretty plausible. But she's going to chip away at that argument. And notice that there are numbered sections, and we're not even in section 1 yet. And she's going to introduce a very famous thought experiment that she's going to refer back to throughout the numbered sections, but she's just sort of introducing it now. And that is, of course, the violinist. So you wake up in you wake up in hospital and find that you're connected by various tubes to a figure in the next bed, and a doctor comes in and tells you that this is a famous violinist. And what happened to you last night is that he was found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records. Nowadays, they would have hacked into the database and discovered that you're the only match, and they have to connect you up in a hurry. You're the only match in the nearby surroundings. So they kidnapped you, they haven't got time to ask your permission, and they don't care if you say no anyway. kidnap you, plug you, and get doctors to plug you in. And the doctors say, we wouldn't have done this, you know, we think that you can't kidnap people, but it's done now. So what's happened is you're connected to this violinist. And, of course, the details are, if you unplug yourself in the next 9 months, which is, of course, the normal time it takes for a fetus to come to term, from conception to birth, the violinist will die. So please don't unplug yourself, because you'll kill this violinist. Now, what she wants to say is, do you have the right to unplug yourself? Well, the question she wants to ask, well, let's be careful about this. Do you have the right to unplug yourself? She would say yes. Therefore, it shouldn't be illegal for you to unplug yourself, because you have the perfect right to do it. And I think that most classes I've asked would agree with that. Certainly in the case of the violinist, they would agree that you have the right to unplug yourself. Now note, as she goes into later, it would be nice of you, you would be possibly a good Samaritan if you stay plugged in. But you don't have to. You have the right to unplug yourself. Now, the point of this, of course, is to really stress the importance of something that she says is often forgotten, which is that the mother has a right to control her own body. This is the choice aspect. And it tends to get forgotten in all this discussion of the right to life of the fetus. And notice that the violinist has a perfect right to life. But despite that, the right to life of the violinist does not extend to the right to use your body. This is what she's going to argue or clarify later on. And that's why our intuitions say we have the right to unplug ourselves. And we should face no consequences for doing so. There should be no law that punishes us for doing this, despite that we know that unplugging ourselves from the violinist will cause the violinist's death. So we are intentionally causing the death of someone with the right to life, but we have the right to do so. And it shouldn't be, we should face no legal consequences for doing so. And she says this is what abortion is like. So therefore, even if the fetus has a right to life from conception, doesn't matter. Women should have the right to have an abortion. Now, right off the bat, I hope most of you will have noticed, a quick objection you could make to her analogy is that it is analogous to pregnancies due to rape. Because, of course, you were kidnapped. You had no choice in the matter. You had no decision. It was not your decision to do anything that involved getting connected to this violinist. You were kidnapped and connected against your will, or certainly without your knowledge. And of course, this makes the case analogous to pregnancy caused by rape. And she freely admits that. She says, yes. If you look at the middle paragraph on the second page. In this case, of course, you were kidnapped, you didn't volunteer for the operation. Can those who oppose abortion on the grounds I have mentioned make an exception for pregnancy due to rape? So in other words, she imagines the people she's arguing against, the people who argue that abortion should be illegal, they could say, fine, we agree you can unplug yourself from the violinist, and we also agree that you can have an abortion in cases of rape. But she says that's not how it normally goes, because if your argument is that the reason why you can't have abortion in most cases is because of the fetus's right to life, well, that should apply to cases like this too, because otherwise you appear to be suggesting that you do not have a right to life if you are the product of rape. And that's just weird. Why should your right to life depend on how you were conceived? I mean, it suggests that, imagine I found out that, imagine I've got an enemy, say someone in the administration at UM Flint who has done me wrong, and I discover that this person was the product of a rape. They know this, but they've dealt with it over the years, but that was how they were conceived, that they were the product of a rape. I can't then say, oh, great, because they're the product of a rape, they don't have the right to life, and therefore I can kill this person and get them out of my hair with no legal repercussions, because they don't have a right to life, because they were a product of rape. That would be ridiculous. So if your argument against abortion is simply on the basis of the right to life, then you can't make an exception on the basis, you can't make an exception for cases of rape. And in fact, hardline anti-abortion people don't make it. He says is, we, the general community, looking at this example, clearly believe that you should be able to have an abortion in those cases. She's appealing to our general moral principles. She says, I'm going to give this example to bring out what everybody's moral intuitions are about an exactly analogous case. Now, this will reveal truly how we feel about pregnancies. Of course, discussing pregnancies becomes complicated because it's already a loaded issue and people come in knowing what they're supposed to think. But so she says, let's abstract from that. Let's just talk about in terms of rights and give a new example. And looking at this new example, we will find out what we really believe about rights. And what do you think, she says. And as I've said, the vast majority of people that I've asked this in classes over the years agree that you have the right to unplug yourself. So, okay, so she right off the bat, she appears to have shown that abortion in cases of rape should be legal. Now, it appears at this point in the article that she takes a step back, because the numbered sections are where she takes on various, she starts with the most extreme anti-abortion view. So in section 1, she discusses what she calls the extreme view, which is that abortion is impermissible even to save the life of the mother. Now this is more extreme even than most Catholics believe. There are Catholic theologians who argue that mother, even though you're not allowed to kill, because they believe in something called the doctrine of double effect, that if you do something and your intention is good, even if you know it's going to have a bad effect, because your intention is good, your intention is to save the life of your the mother, then it is permissible to kill a fetus in so doing. So some Catholic theologians aren't this extreme. So it's a very extreme position. So why is she taking it on when she's already appears to have knocked down a less extreme view? Well, she wants to proceed logically through the most extreme, slightly less extreme, slightly less extreme, slightly less extreme, and in so doing, learn something about the nature of rights. That's actually Judith Jarvis Thomson's main ethical issue, is what kind of rights we have, what they extend to, and she wants to learn what we actually believe about rights from a lot of these little analogies. So this article is packed with analogies, almost too many analogies, but each of them has a purpose, and each of them is her way of bringing out what we feel about, what we believe about the rights of the people involved. Yes, you have a second paper coming up, and one of the topics is on this article. One of the things you might want to do is criticize her analogies. We discussed arguments by analogy when we were talking about the argument from design. Remember, Paley's argument is an argument by analogy, his watch argument. Judith Jarvis Thomson, is doing a lot of arguing by analogy in this article. Be careful if you criticize her analogy. So, for example, you might say that the violinist case isn't analogous to pregnancy for various reasons. If you do that, that's a perfectly legitimate approach, but you must be careful to do it thoroughly. So, for example, you can't just point out one difference between the violinist case and the abortion case, because, of course, there will be many differences. So, for example, if you say, oh, this isn't like a pregnancy because the fetus is a lot smaller. Yes, that's true, unless we don't know. One of the details we've not been told is that this is a famous, very small violinist. But that is a difference. But does that undermine the analogy? Does the difference make a moral? Lots of descriptive differences between the case of the violinist or any of these analogies that she uses and the things that she claims that they're analogous to. There always will be differences. Otherwise, you're not making an analogy. You're just comparing two identical things. But what you've got to show is that there is a difference that makes a moral difference. So, once you've identified a difference that you think is important, to prove that it is important and that it makes a difference to our intuitions, you then apply that difference to rework the violinist case. So, imagine I say that the difference that this is a bad analogy because the fetus is much smaller. Well, to check to see that that would actually make a difference, I then redescribe the violinist case with that difference built in. So I say, okay, now I'm going to describe the violinist case, only this time the violinist is tiny. Notice that makes no difference whatsoever. We still think that we have a perfect right. We still think that. So that shows that the difference that you've identified doesn't undermine Thomson's argument. There are other differences that you might think do make a difference. So, for example, imagine that you're related to the violinist in the same way that a mother is related to the fetus. Would that make a difference? If you say that that's the key difference, and then redescribe the violinist case and show that it makes a difference. One important difference that might be relevant is that an abortion isn't simply unplugging yourself. It requires, typically, the destruction of the embryo. And this is something that anti-abortion activists play up to a great extent. They show, there are famous videos of abortions where you see the fetus being destroyed, being cut up into pieces. And these are understandably horrific. But so what they want to say is, see, this is what you are allowing when you allow abortions. So maybe if you just redescribe the violinist case and say that the only way to unplug yourself from the violinist is if you cut the violinist up, then see if that makes a difference. That would be a better approach. But that is what you have to do. If you're criticizing the analogy, you can't just identify a difference and then say, see, they're different, so it doesn't work. You've got to then redescribe the violinist case with that difference and show that now that changes how what we believe we're entitled to do in the violinist case. Okay. That aside, let's just continue with the article. So, bottom of page 2, you see the number 1, and then page 3, you have section 1, which is where she's discussing the extreme view, which is that abortions are impermissible even to save the mother's life. How might you argue for this? She says the most familiar argument, this is the second paragraph on that page, is the following. We are told that performing the abortion would be directly unfortunately, this copy that I gave you is obviously a scan of the original article, and there are several awkward typos in it. It was just easier for me to do than to actually scan it from a book, and easier to read. But it says, we're told that performing the abortion would be directly killing the child. There shouldn't be an S there, obviously. Whereas doing nothing would not be killing the mother, but merely letting her die. Moreover, in killing the child, one would be killing an innocent person, for the child has committed no crime. So this argument is depending on the killing, letting die distinction. In other words, the reason why you should favor the fetus. So this is a situation, and this is sadly not that uncommon. Pregnancy is very dangerous. A friend of ours just recently was induced early because she had gestational diabetes, and that's not uncommon. And if you have gestational diabetes, that means that during the course of your pregnancy you become a little bit diabetic, and they have to monitor you pretty carefully. And at any rate, anyone pregnant, they monitor their blood pressure, because if you want to watch a video online, there are videos that show what happens to the mother's internal organs during pregnancy. And basically, they get forced out of the way and smushed into various places. This is why, of course, famously, pregnant women need to pee a lot, because the bladder is completely crushed by the growing baby. So they have a much smaller bladder, essentially, so they have to empty it much more often. And women, the mother's internal organs are pushed all aside. And, you know, pregnancy permanently alters many features of your body. I mean, I'm sure if you ask your mother what bearing you did to her body, she'll be able to tell you. I mean, if you're a C-section, she'll have a giant scar because of you. A lot of mothers have stretch marks, which is where essentially their skin reaches the limit of the elasticity and suddenly goes, and you have these sort of pucker marks all over her abdomen, which never go away. And that's just a minor side effect of pregnancy. So pregnancy is a major ordeal for the mother's body, and sometimes it can be very dangerous. The hormones involved in pregnancy can mean that cancer is much more likely. If you're diagnosed with cancer while you're pregnant, basically they tell you you've got to have an abortion now, because going through the pregnancy, the hormones will it'll be like gasoline on a fire to the cancer cells. The hormones will encourage the growth of the cancer cells to a massive extent, and you will not survive this pregnancy. So there are many circumstances when the life of the mother is at risk. And that's why a lot of abortions are argued for, where the mother wants the child. There's nothing wrong with the child. The mother intended to have this pregnancy, but doctors tell her, you will not survive if you bring this baby to term. Now, the extreme view says you can't have an abortion in those cases. Why? The argument says that if you have an abortion, you will be killing the fetus, whereas if you let the fetus come to term and the mother dies, you haven't killed anybody. You've just allowed the mother to die of natural causes, as it were. And killing is worse than letting die. Now, we've already looked in the last section, killing and letting die. In the survival lottery, we saw Y and Z argue against this principle. And, of course, there's another article by Rachel's where he argues against it in the context of euthanasia. And this is another case where Thomson rejects it. She says, it cannot seriously be said. She says that nobody could really argue that if the mother could perform the abortion herself, that she should be prevented from doing so. Because this is analogous to self-defense. As she says, it cannot seriously be thought to be murder if the mother performs an abortion on herself to save her life. It cannot seriously be said that she must refrain, that she must sit passively by and wait for her death. Let us look again at the case of you and the violinist. There you are in bed with the violinist, and the director of the hospital says, "It's all most distressing and I deeply sympathize, but you see this is putting an additional strain on your kidneys, and you'll be dead within the month. But you have to stay where you are all the same, because unplugging you would be directly killing an innocent violinist, and that's murder, and that's impermissible." As she says, this is a fairly strong quote, "If anything in the world is true, it is that you do not commit murder, you do not do what is impermissible if you reach around to your back and unplug yourself from that violinist to save your life." And to illustrate it, she gives one of her more over-the-top science fiction analogies, which is the one, this is near the bottom of page 3. Suppose you, it says filed, it should say find. Suppose you find yourself trapped in a tiny house with a growing child. I mean a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child. You are already up against the wall of the house. In a few minutes you'll be crushed to death. There was an animated movie that I think is unfairly forgotten from a few years ago called Monsters vs. Aliens. I don't know why it wasn't Pixar, it wasn't one of the big animation houses, but it was really good. Check it out on DVD. But it's a sort of parody of old 50s monster movies. In the 50s, there was this rash of movies where there were sort of creature features, like The Creature from the Black Lagoon. There was this great 50s horror movie called Them, which is about giant ants. There's another really good one called Tarantula, which is about a giant tarantula. And there was a kind of crappy B-movie one called Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. This movie, Monsters vs. Aliens, imagines all of those monsters sort of teaming up together to fight this alien invasion. And it's funny, and it's really good. It's got a great voice cast. It's got Seth Rogen. It's got Stephen Colbert. It's got a bunch of people in there. Hugh Laurie from House. Check it out. But the main character, I think, is it Reese Witherspoon, I think is the voice, plays this Gigantica, who is the woman who grows rapidly. Well, that's what's going on here. A tiny house with a rapidly growing baby. You're going to be crushed. If nothing is done to stop him from growing, he'll be hurt, but in the end, he'll simply burst open the house and walk out a free man. We're on page 4 now. But you will, of course, be crushed. The point of this analogy is to say this is analogous to a woman, the dilemma a woman faces if it's a choice between performing an abortion on herself, perhaps by taking Plan B. I mean, that's a simple chemically induced abortion, but I don't know how dangerous that would be in many of the cases where women have to have an abortion. I don't know if Plan B contains hormones that are just as bad and would be bad for someone with cancer to take it. But in the bad old days, of course, one of the symbols of the pro-choice movement you may have seen is women who were in the 70s who were arguing for legal abortion used to wear badges that had coat hangers with a red line through it. And that's a reference to the fact that coat hangers were often used by women to perform abortions on themselves, or were used by back alley abortionists to perform abortion. Because, if you know old-fashioned metal coat hangers, there's a wire hook on that thing, and that was used to destroy the fetus. So that's a pretty graphic reference. But so women did perform abortion, and all over the world still do perform abortions on themselves. At great risk, because actually a lot of women died because they perforated their uterus trying to perform an abortion and bled to death internally. So both of them died in those cases. Anyway, the point of this example is to argue that we all believe that self-defense gives a woman the right to have an abortion. So even though it is killing an innocent, rights-bearing person, of course you have the right to do it. So one of the things that is a running theme, of course, in this entire article is that the right to life doesn't mean that all killing of innocent people is wrong. And of course, one of the classic examples used to show that we already saw in the Stephen Law chapter is self-defense. Now, normally, of course, in self-defense, we don't think that the other person is innocent, but imagine cases where, like in the series of cases where, somebody's blocking the cave entrance and 20 people will drown and the only way to get him out is to kill him. A lot of people say, well, you got to kill him, even though he's innocent. And of course, the case of the submarine, where we blew up the submarine, killing the innocent crew, because otherwise, through no fault of their own, it would have launched a missile. So certainly, we seem to believe that killing an innocent person is not always impermissible, and she wants to argue that this is one of those cases. So at the end of section 1, she says, in sum, a woman can surely defend her life against the threat to it posed by the unborn child, even if doing so involves its death. And this shows not merely that the theses in 1 through 4, those are the claims used in the argument in the middle paragraph on page 3, are wrong, are false. It shows also that the extreme view of abortion, which remember is that abortion is impermissible even to save the life of the mother, is false. Okay, so now section 2, she's looking at a less extreme. She says, the extreme view could of course be weakened to say that while abortion is permissible to save the mother's life, it may not be performed by a third party. So notice all that she's shown with the tiny house growing baby case is that it's permissible for the person involved to kill the baby to save her life. But she says you could argue that while that is permissible, it's not permissible for a third party to get involved. She's imagining that view. That's the view that she's considering in section 2. And this is the one that this is where she brings in the case of Smith and Jones and the house. The coat. This is in the middle of the first paragraph of section 2. If Jones has found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, then it is not impartiality, which means impartiality means not being biased to either one, like a judge should be impartial. It is not impartiality that says, I cannot choose between you, when Smith owns the coat. Women have said again and again, this body is my body, and they have reason to feel angry, reason to feel that it has been shouting into the wind. Smith, after all, is hardly like to bless us if we say, of course it's your coat, anybody would grant that it is, but no one may choose between you and Jones as to who is to have it. So in other words, what she's saying is here is, imagine Smith and Jones are fighting over a coat, and one of them will die if they don't wear it. You're a third party, and you know that it's Smith's coat. Are you allowed to say, should you side with Smith? And she says, yes, you should, because it's Smith's coat. That's what rights mean. We're saying that both Smith and Jones have the right to life, but what we also must acknowledge is that Smith has the right of property over the coat. And of course, this is analogous to Smith and Jones are like the mother and the baby, but the coat is the use of the mother's body to survive. And the fact that the mother owns her body is relevant, and a third party should acknowledge that. Now she says, one thing that could undermine this argument on page 5 is if you believe that the mother does not own her body. I suppose, this is the last paragraph of section 2. I suppose that in some views of human life, the mother's body is only on loan to her, the loan not being one which gives her any prior claim to that. I shall simply ignore this possibility, she says. In other words, having raised it, she's going to dismiss it. My own view is that if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, then in other words, if you can own anything, and you believe you can own, I believe that I can own this phone, well, your ownership of your phone, anything you think you believe, is less obvious and less secure than your ownership of your own body. So if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, he has a just prior claim to his own body. So she dismisses the idea that the mother does not own her own body. All right, section 3. What view of abortion is she arguing there? She's saying she considers the claim. Here she's moving on to cases where the mother's life is not at stake. So the first two section 1 is the extreme view, which it says that you can't have abortion, you can't even perform an abortion yourself to save your own life. She dismisses that. Second one is, okay, you can perform the abortion, but nobody else can. You can't get an abortionist. You can't get a doctor involved. She dismisses that. So now this one is where the mother's life is not at stake. So now the mother's life is not threatened. Surely then she can't commit an abortion, goes the anti-abortion argument, because the child's right to life is weightier than anything other than the mother's own right to life. So in other words, what this says is, yeah, okay, in cases where you have to choose where one of them will die, it's okay to side with the mother. But in cases where only the fetus will die, the mothers can't have any right that's weighty enough to mean that the fetus must die because of the mother's rights. So that's the position she's going to argue against now. This argument treats the right to life as if it were unproblematic. It is not, and this seems to me precisely the source of the mistake. For we should now, at long last, ask what it comes to have a right to life. Yes. So in this section, she's going to look very closely about what exactly the right to life is. And this is an important thing to examine. For example, this is a key difference between, say, libertarians, who think that the government should get out of everything, political libertarians. We talked about metaphysical libertarians in the discussion on free will. This is political libertarians who say basically the government should be minimal. Like Rand Paul, who was the only person to vote against the coronavirus bill and then tested positive for coronavirus. Maybe God does have a sense of humor. So libertarians say our right to life is what is called a negative right. That is, it's simply a right not to be killed directly. Whereas socialists say we have a positive right to life. A positive right to life is the negative right to life, so you mustn't be killed, plus more. It says if you have the right to life, you have the right to demand things of other people more than just them not killing you. So, for example, if you believe in a positive right to life, you believe that the state should ensure that you don't starve. Libertarians can look at a homeless person starving in the gutter and say their right to life is not being violated because I'm not killing them. Nobody's killing them, they're just starving. Whereas people who believe in a positive right to life would say, no, their right to life is being violated because they're dying and nobody's helping. Now, it turns out that that Thomson is going to argue that we believe in a more negative right to life. And here you might say that her argument is pitched at Americans in particular, because Americans tend to have narrower views of rights than perhaps elsewhere in the world, certainly than socialist countries. But anyway, she's going to argue that the right to life is actually fairly narrow. And the first step is her example of Henry Fonda. You might have heard of Jane Fonda. She turned 80, I think, just recently, and is currently, well, was in the news before the coronavirus, because she was getting arrested every Friday protesting for climate in Washington. And she would occasionally bring along famous people like Sam Donaldson and Ted Danson, and people like that would show up and get arrested with her. She's Henry Fonda's daughter. Henry Fonda was famous first. He famously played Lincoln in a film about Lincoln. I'm trying to think of what his most famous movie might be. Possibly 12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men is a great movie. You should check that out. It's a 50s black and white movie, but he's the star of that movie. He's in a bunch of things. He normally plays... is he in Inherit the Wind? No. Is he? I can't remember. Anyway, he was a huge film star of like the 40s and the 50s. And Judith Jarvis Thomson is old now. She must be older than Jane Fonda. But anyway, clearly she had a crush on Henry Fonda at some point. Henry Fonda is, of course, long dead. He won an Oscar very late in life for a movie called On Golden Pond, where he plays part of an old couple with Katharine Hepburn, another classic star. But everybody said they kind of gave him the Oscar because he should have got it years ago, even though the movie was not that great. Anyway, Henry Fonda, great film star. She imagines this: if I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same, I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast. She's at MIT, which is it in Boston? I think it's in Boston. Anyway, Massachusetts. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast to provide it. It would be less nice, though no doubt well meant, if my friends flew out to the West Coast and brought Henry Fonda back with them. But I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. Or again, to return to the story I told earlier, the fact that for continued life the violinist needs the continued use of your kidneys does not establish that he has the right to be given the use of your kidneys. So, here's the key thing she's arguing. Even though the fetus, we're granting that the fetus has the same rights as an adult, the same rights as the violinist, the right to life, that doesn't include the right to get something from other people. So, in the Henry Fonda example, my right to life does not include the right to force Henry Fonda to save my life. And the violinist's right to life doesn't include the right to force you to give up the use of your body. Top of page 6. Some people are rather stricter about the right to life. In their view, it does not include the right to be given anything, but amounts to, and only to, the right not to be killed by anybody. But even this, she said. So let's say we say, okay, yeah, sure, the fetus doesn't have a positive right to demand something of other individuals that they haven't freely given. Now, of course, you can acquire the right to be given something from somebody, but only through the free action on their part. So in other words, if you don't have the right to my car, but if I promise to give you my car, say because you've given me $5,000, you overpaid if you give me that for my car. But if you give me $5,000 and I say, okay, yeah, you get my car now, then you have a right to my car, but only because I did something. But unless I do something, you do not have the right to my car, or you do not have the right to use my body. So of course, we're going to consider that later on, because the suggestion might be by getting pregnant, the mother gave the right to the fetus. But what we're talking about now is merely by having the right to life, that doesn't give the right to use the mother's body. And even having the right not to be killed by anybody doesn't, she says, actually, what you have the right to is the right not to be killed unjustly. You don't have the right to not to be killed by anyone because, you know, what if you're going to cause somebody's death because you're a growing baby? You have the right to life, but that doesn't mean you have the right not to be killed. What you do have is the right not to be killed unjustly, she's going to say at the bottom in section 4. But the point in section 3, just above section 4 on page 6, is I am arguing only that having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the use of or a right to be allowed continued use of another person's body. So in section 3, she's arguing against the claim that no rights the mother has are weighty enough to trump the baby's right to life. And what she's saying is, yes, they are, because the right to life that the baby has does not include the right to use somebody else's body. So the mother's right to her own body means that she can deny it to the baby even if it causes its death, just as you can deny the use of your kidneys to the violinist, thereby causing his death, and his right to life does not mean that you can't do that. Okay, section 4. There is another way to bring out this difficulty. In the most ordinary sort of case, to deprive somebody of what he has a right to is to treat him unjustly. Suppose a boy and his small brother are jointly given a box of chocolates for Christmas. If the older boy takes the box and refuses to give his brother any of the chocolates, he is unjust to him, for the brother has been given a right to half of them. But in the case of the violinist, you do not act unjustly to the violinist in denying the violinist the use of your kidneys, because he doesn't have a right to them. So in summary, bottom paragraph on page 6, the emendation which may be made at this point is this: the right to life consists in not the right not to be killed, but rather the right not to be killed unjustly. Okay, so this, having established this, she says, this reveals the gap in the argument against abortion. The argument against abortion basically, remember, went, the fetus has a right to life, therefore you can't have an abortion. She says the gap in the argument is, it is no means enough to show that the fetus is a person and to remind us that all persons have a right to life. We need to be shown that killing the fetus violates its right to life. So the gap is between showing that the fetus has a right to life and showing that it's wrong to kill it. There's a gap there. It doesn't follow directly from the right to life of the fetus that it is wrong to kill the fetus, just as it doesn't follow directly from the right to life of the violinist that it's wrong to kill the violinist. And merely by getting pregnant, the mother doesn't give them a right. Now, remember, each of these sections is supposed to be considering a different view on abortion. So now she's considering, well, what if someone were to argue that involuntarily getting pregnant through unprotected sex, the woman gave the fetus the right? So yes, the fetus's right to life does not, by itself, include the right to use the mother's body. But, this argument goes, suppose we say that it has the extra right to use the mother's body because the mother gave the fetus that right by engaging in intercourse. Because that's something she did freely. Let's assume we're not talking about rape cases here. Let's assume that that's something she did freely. She consented to the sex. So therefore, just as when I sell you my car, me agreeing with you that you can have my car is something I do freely, and I therefore give you the right to my car. Isn't this analogous? And she says, so she imagines the anti-abortionist saying, but doesn't her partial responsibility for the fetus's being there itself give it a right to the use of her body? That's the position. Now she's going to argue against it. But the first thing she says is, notice that this is a new move. This is something new. Opponents of abortion have been so concerned to make out the independence of the fetus in order to establish it has a right to life that they have tended to overlook the possible support they might gain from making out that the fetus is dependent on the mother. But, she says, I don't agree with this. I don't agree that merely by having sex, even unprotected sex, that you give the right of the fetus the right to the fetus to use your body. And to argue against this, she gives the burglar case at the bottom of page 7. If the room is stuffy, presumably this is analogous to being horny, if the room is stuffy and I therefore open a window to air it, in response to my overwhelming desire to have sex, and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She's given him a right to the use of her house. You can see the analogy there. So she wants to have sex, she has sex, and as a result becomes pregnant. It doesn't mean that, just as the burglar doesn't have a right to your house, just because you left a window open knowing that there were burglars around, doesn't mean that the fetus has a right to use the body, woman's body. Now notice that this is analogous at most to cases where the mother does not intend to be pregnant. So this wouldn't cover cases where a woman tried to get pregnant and then changes her mind later. This is a case where a woman just intends to have sex, does not intend to get pregnant, but happens to get pregnant. And of course, she changes it. She says it's even more obvious that the burglar doesn't have a right if you put bars on the window, or her example specifically talking about protected sex where you use contraception, is the people seeds one. You know, if you thought that the rapidly growing baby example was science fiction, well, wait till you get to the people seeds one. Top of page 8. Suppose people seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your window, one may drift in and take root in your carpet or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens. These are obviously the contraceptives. The very best you can buy. There's a Friends episode where Rachel gets pregnant after using condoms, and she says, you know, it doesn't say that on the packaging that you can still get pregnant. If you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpet. As can happen, however, and on very, very rare occasions does happen, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to the use of your house? And she assumes that everybody is going to say no. So what she's trying to show here is that having sex is not the kind of behavior that grants a right to the fetus to use your body. It's not like me agreeing with you that you can have my car, or not like me agreeing with you that you can rent a room in my house. If I do that, then of course you have the right to use my house because of something I intentionally did. But me just leaving my door open, knowing you're in the neighborhood, that doesn't count. And so that's more like the kind of case of having sex and getting pregnant. It seems to me that the argument we were looking at can establish at most that there are some cases in which the unborn person has the right to use a mother's body, and therefore some cases in which abortion is unjust killing, but not cases where you just have sex. Section 5 is where she is considering, she talks instead, up to this point she's talked in terms of rights. So rights are things that can be legally enforced. If you have a right to something, the law should back you up. So if I have a right to your car, you should be legally compelled to give me your car, or I can go to the law and compel you. I can sue you. There are other cases where some action you might do might be wrong, but not unjust. So the way she uses the word justice involves rights. So if I treat you unjustly, I violate something you have a right to. Now she says that doesn't cover all cases of wrongness. So treating you unjustly is just a sort of subset of ways to treat you wrongly. I can treat you wrongly. In fact, I can act very immorally to you without being unjust to you. So, for example, if I don't save you, so she considers, later on, she considers the case of the Good Samaritan. If I don't save you, then I might be wrong to you, but I'm not necessarily unjust. Actually, she doesn't. A better example would be, no, I can use the example that she gives. So she gives an example at the bottom of page 8 where a boy, she changes the chocolates example. So in the original box of chocolates example, the box was given to both boys equally, and the older brother ate them all, and therefore he treated the younger brother unjustly because the younger brother by right owned half the chocolates and didn't get them. Whereas she changes it and says, imagine the box of chocolates, it was only given to the older boy. Then if he eats them all, he's not treating his younger brother unjustly. Is he being shitty? Absolutely. He is treating the other boy immorally. He is not doing what he ought to do. He ought to share because it's good to share. But rights are not the same as what it is good to do. There is a much wider range of things of what you morally ought to do that the law can't compel you to do. That you morally ought not to be shitty to your friends. You ought to show up when you said you would. You ought not to lie to people. You ought not to cheat on people. But that's not illegal. You might say that that is not something that they have a right against you for. But so she says that there may absolutely be cases where it would be morally indecent of you to have an abortion. She says she imagines the 1 hour a 1 hour version of the Violinist. If you only have to stay plugged in for 1 hour, it would absolutely be morally indecent of you to unplug yourself. But do you have the right to unplug yourself? Yes. So you wouldn't be treating the Violinist unjustly, even if you just were avoiding 1 hour's worth by unplugging yourself. But you would be morally indecent. So what she says that simply because you ought to do something doesn't imply that somebody has a right against you that you should do it. My own view is that it does not follow from the truth of this that you would be that the older brother would be greedy and a little shit if he didn't share the chocolates. My own view is that it does not follow from the truth of that the younger brother has any right to them. So just because something is morally indecent doesn't mean that somebody has a right against you that you not do it. A further objection, this is on page 9, a further objection to using the term right, that is, she says that some people use the term right to say any time you doing something to somebody else would be morally indecent, then they have a right against you that you not do it. She says that's too loose a use of the term right. Morally indecent is not the same as having a right that the person not do it. So a further objection to this broader use of right that she's objecting to is that from the fact that A ought to do a thing for B, it follows that A has a right against A that A do it for him. She's arguing against that view, is that it is going to make the question of whether or not a man has a right to a thing turn on how easy it is to provide him. And she says that's ridiculous. So if Henry Fonda only had to walk across the room, does that mean that I have a right that Henry Fonda walk across the room? She says, no, I don't have a right. How easy it is for him to do something doesn't affect what rights I have for him to do. Either I have a right for him to touch my head because of something he's freely done, or I don't. Now, in this case, if all he has to do is walk across the room, he'd be morally indecent not to, but that doesn't mean that I have a right that he do it. Now, section 6, Good Samaritan. Here she's talking about cases where she says there's being a Good Samaritan, which requires, Jesus said we should all be Good Samaritans. If you don't know the story of the Good Samaritan, well, you're in luck because she gives it to you. You should know that story. That's a parable of Jesus. And Jesus says, go there and do likewise, which, of course, most Christians don't, because most Christians don't actually act like Christ, because it would be very difficult to act like Christ. It would require sacrifices and giving up your property, and people don't want to do that. But the story of the Good Samaritan is someone who went out of his way and gave up a lot to help somebody he didn't have to help. Should we be legally compelled to be Good Samaritans? No. She says we don't even... she says, in no state in this country is any man compelled by law to be even a minimally decent Samaritan. A minimally decent Samaritan is someone who would have at least stopped when there was no risk to them and checked on the guy. She says the law does not compel anyone even to be a minimally decent Samaritan. Now, that's not quite true anymore. If you ever watched the last episode of Seinfeld, what the gang in Seinfeld end up in prison because they violate a Good Samaritan law. Some states now have Good Samaritan laws, where if you pass by an accident without helping, or you see a crime committed and you do not report it, you can be fined. You can be punished, because now these require you to do something positive. And at the time she was writing, there's no laws on these. And she says, but notice what anti-abortion laws are the only kind of laws. They are unique, she says, amongst all laws in the country, in that they require someone to be a Good Samaritan. They are forcing a woman to do something for somebody who has no right to demand it. I should think myself that minimally decent Samaritan laws would be one thing, Good Samaritan laws quite another. And you might argue that what are called Good Samaritan laws are actually what she would call minimally decent, because you're not being asked to run across the road and intercede when you see a crime. All you're being asked to do is alert the police, and if you don't do that, you haven't done something minimal. Okay, I've talked for so long, nobody's listening anymore, so let me just summarize the last thing. She says, surely we do not have any such in section 7, she considers the possibility that being genetically related to the fetus means that because of this relationship, the fetus has a right to use the mother's body. She dismisses this. She thinks, as most libertarians, for example, would believe, that the only way you incur, that you give other people's rights to something from you, is by something you've freely done and expressly agreed to. She says, so merely from the fact that the mother is related to the fetus, surely we do not have any such special responsibility for a person unless we have assumed it explicitly or implicitly. So if I explicitly assume it, I say, I give you this right. Implicitly would be if they say, don't raise your hand if you give me this right. And I stand there and I sort of look at them, and obviously I don't do anything, but from my inaction, I clearly am signaling that I'm giving you a right. But in both cases, I have to be aware that there's a discussion about this, and I have to be freely doing something. Being related is not like that. If a set of parents do not try to prevent pregnancy, do not obtain abortion, but rather take it home with them, then they have assumed responsibility for it. They have given it rights. So this is an example of being explicit. All right, last summary. Section 8. She says, my is permissible in a lot of cases, will be found unsatisfactory on 2 counts by many of those who want to regard abortion as morally permissible. So she says, a lot of people who are pro-choice won't like my argument for 2 reasons. First, while I do argue that abortion is not impermissible, that is, she says that some abortions should be legal, I do not argue that it is always permissible. So she argues that there are some abortions that it is okay to outlaw. And those would be cases, presumably, where people tried to get pregnant and then at the last minute say, I don't want it. Because that would be a case where you can make a serious case that you have given the right to the fetus to use your body. So that might be like analogous to the case, the violinist case, if the Society of Music Lovers said, or had a raffle and said, if you enter this raffle, then if your number comes up, you have to be plugged into the violinist. And you did that, and your number came up. Well, then she might say, then you can't unplug yourself because you did something intentionally, knowing that you could be plugged in and aware of aware of what you were doing. So therefore, you have to stay plugged in. She says, yes, in that case, you cannot unplug yourself because you have given the violinist the right to give the right to use your body. So because there might be cases like that with the fetus, not every kind of abortion should be legal, should be permissible. Now, most, it seems like, should be permissible, she's arguing, but there are some that can be outlawed. And of course, there are also a large number that would be indecent. Remember, morally indecent would be like the brother who owns all the chocolates, eating all of them in front of his brother. He has a right to them, he's not treating them unjustly. He shouldn't be compelled by law to share them, but he's being morally indecent. He's being callous and selfish. And there might be a wide range of those, she says. But she certainly believes that there are plenty of abortions that not only should be legally permissible, but the mother is not being morally indecent in doing them. Certainly abortions for self-defense, she's not being morally indecent. So her position is essentially there are many abortions that should be permissible. Some of the ones that are permissible might be morally indecent, but there are also some abortions that are not only morally indecent, but should be impermissible, should be outlawed. And not all pro-choice people are going to like that, she says. But she says, a sick and desperately frightened 14-year-old schoolgirl pregnant due to rape, that not only should be permissible, it's not morally indecent at all. However, the second thing that pro-choicers might not like about her position, she is not arguing for the right to secure the death of the unborn child. So, if it were possible to separate the fetus from the woman's body without killing it, then she cannot thereby say, oh, I want that fetus dead. Because this would be like, you unplug yourself from the violinist and he survives. You can't then say, oh, I don't want the violinist to survive, I'm going to go kill him. You can't do that. That is violating his right to life. So if our technology improves, as it might, to the extent that, you could remove a fetus, remove an embryo from mother's body and give it to somebody else, or implant it in a surrogate, or put it in an artificial womb, then you would absolutely have to do that. Now notice a lot of pro-choicers aren't going to like that, because that means that there's a child that they're biologically connected to would be out there in the world. They might say, wait a minute, that's my property, that's my genetic property, you can't decide what happens to it. And she says, well, if we're saying that it has the right to life, then you can. But notice at the end she says, at this time, however, it should be remembered that we have only been pretending throughout that the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception. I never really believed that. I just wanted to show that even if you grant that, it doesn't mean that abortion should be illegal. All right, I've said enough. That's Judith Jarvis Thomson's